Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons, and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Welcome to the show, everyone. Special guest today. And actually, we were just laughing before we came on because most of you know, I was telling, this is Dr. Beth Westy, who is an expert in female hormones and all things menopause, female fat loss, hormone cycles, all the things. And I was telling her that, of course, that's been my work for almost my entire career. But of course, I've never had a menstrual cycle and I'm never going to go through menopause. And so I'm happy that you all get to finally hear from someone who will not just experiences these things, but also works with a ton of women. So welcome, Dr. Beth Westy. It's so good to have you on the show.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, same. Let's begin with the idea of hormones and whether they matter or not. Let me set it up for you this way, right? There's been an ongoing argument forever in the health and fitness world that calories matter and that's all that matters. And of course, in the last 10 years, we've heard an awful lot about, well, hormones matter and that's all that matters, right? And so there's this camp kind of going back and forth. And I think you and I would certainly say hormones matter and they matter a lot. From my perspective, I would say both matter and they matter equally. But I would love for you to educate us on how you see this whole thing and how hormones get involved and how you as a clinician approach this idea of incorporating the knowledge of hormones into weight loss and health specifically for women.
Yeah. Yes. This is such an important debate that people are having. And I'm sure you do too, get frustrated at the idea that we are just simple math equations, calories in, calories out. That's going to equal weight loss of some kind. And yeah, calories do matter and to a point, because the way I say it is 100 calories of almonds is very different than 100 calories of gummy bears for what it's going to do. So it's not just about the calorie, right? And what it's doing to your system and how your physiology is set up to process those nutrients is really, really important. And for the female body, the way our hormones shift and change alters how you absorb, process nutrients, a lot of other things. Because we forget about the fact that estrogen and progesterone go everywhere in the body. We think of women's health as, they call it bikini health, just the areas that a bikini covers, and that's women's health, right? But when we're looking at the impact of hormones in the body and your overall metabolism and how those things, work together synergistically, it's a systemic impact. Just like thyroid, right? People talk, it's just calories in, calories out, and women and anybody, male or female, men or women, and they're like, I can't lose weight. And they're like, oh, look, you have hypothyroidism. No wonder.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And, it's interesting, I don't know that, many people know women obviously are impacted more by thyroid, partly because of how estrogen impacts thyroid carrier proteins and things like that. But I'm one of these people who can gain muscle really easily, but I gain fat really easily. And it's a little slow to come off because I'm one of the few men, not a lot of men have this, but I have Hashimoto's, thyroiditis and hypothyroid. And it does make things a challenge. And it does bring up an interesting question Beth, because from my perspective, when I think about hormones, right, we do kind of get this whole thing where when we think of hormones, we typically think of sex steroids, but you just brought up the idea of, things like thyroid, things like cortisol, things like insulin. Some of these hormones are more impactful or more influential in some ways than the sex steroids. And of course, they communicate sort of back and forth. And so when you're thinking of hormonal weight loss, what are you primarily dealing with women? Is it all of the above? Is it primarily estrogen and progesterone? And how do these things figure in to this from a woman? Because we hear it all the time, right? Women go, I need to balance my hormones. And sometimes I'm like, well, I wonder what hormones they're talking about.
Yeah. Yes. I feel like that's the biggest question there. What hormones are you talking about? And for so many women, it's like, I feel like something's off in my body. And the trouble is that a lot of these symptoms overlap. I'm fatigued. I'm gaining weight and I can't lose it. I'm not gaining muscle. Which is it? Right? Do you not have enough testosterone? Do you have a cortisol issue? Do you have a thyroid issue? All of the above, right? It's so hard to identify. So I do hormone testing. I do Dutch testing. So a urine test for hormones that gives you the metabolites of it and how it's processed in the body. That's my favorite to kind of discern a lot of these things. So it tests all of those hormones except for thyroid. It doesn't test your thyroid hormones. And that's a great place to just take a look at where you're starting. But it is the combination of everything, right? And when we look at like I'm eating food, I'm exercising, I'm trying to be healthy. Why isn't this working? There's usually something off. One of my favorite books, it's called Doing Harm. Have you read it?
I have not. Who's that by?
Oh, you're going to love this.
I'm putting it on my list.
Yes. Doing Harm. It's a long book. It's an Audible as well. The lazy science that leaves women misdiagnosed and sick or something is the subtitle. And the whole first chunk of the book, when I first read it, I was enraged because a lot of the stuff that they talk about in terms of how health is set up in our Western world is based on a male body. For so many years, they only allowed men into medical schools. For so many years, only men did research, and they did research primarily on male bodies, right? You can go all the way back to like the Flexner report, and start from that position forward in time, which is like 100 years ago now, I think, that the way things were created in this country and why things end up the way that they are now and how slow that transition takes. So even though over the last decade or so, it's actually half of the women half of the population in higher education for health are female, right? Women are, going to college, going to grad school, getting in the health field and all these different areas. Yet still research is not done on the female body because it takes longer. Yeah. Because of the hormone fluctuation. So it's more expensive. And so companies are like, oh, that's not right. We don't want to pay more to get accurate data. So we're just going to put a few women in the study and then call those points outliers and kick them out.
Yeah. And it's unpredictable too. I think it wasn't until 2001. That's usually the stat that I use that they actually came out with the AMA, ADA, several other of these bodies actually saying, hey, look, women are dramatically underrepresented in the research across the board. And it was just a couple years ago that I forget which journal it was. I think it was a journal Cardiac that basically came out and said women are still dramatically underrepresented in cardiovascular disease studies. And part of what that is about, for those of you who are listening, is part of what it is that just what Dr. Beth was saying, that, a lot of the universities historically were dominated by men. The research departments were dominated by men. But one of the things that they often cite, and this will get us in, Beth, talking about how these hormones affect things, is that women and their hormones, they fluctuate throughout the month. Men are pretty static. Women have two sex steroids. Men have two main sex steroids. Men have one main sex steroid. Women go through 4 stages of hormonal, even perhaps 5 if they get pregnant, hormonal stages in their life. Men go through at most 2, puberty and andropause. And so when you're doing studies on this, it's a lot to control. And also we know that each woman and their hormone cycle looks an awful lot like a hormonal fingerprint. So it's very difficult to draw conclusions. If you're in your luteal phase and you're doing the study versus you're in your follicular phase and you're doing a study, we know that women process carbohydrates differently at those times. We know their exercise capacity is different at these times. We know their moods change along with this. And so this is part of the issue that I think women are having. And what I would love to know from you is like, where do you tend to start with this conversation when women are coming in and saying, hey, I'm doing everything right, I'm not getting results, I am counting the calories, or I did try this new diet? It sounds like what you began to do is look at some of these hormone profiles, or do you look at symptoms only, or is it a little bit of both? I'm curious how you run things.
Yeah. My process for all of it. It is both. It is symptoms, and then again, I Dutch test. There's other urine tests for comprehensive hormones, but that one's just my favorite for the wide array of information that you get from it. And then going through that information and really customizing things for people, because if they've already been struggling, if you've already done X, Y, and Z, why start there, right? Take how you're feeling, how your body's responding, and that data. And Dutch testing is done if you have a cycle. It's done at a certain point of the cycle, so you're catching, between days 19 to 22 of the cycle on an average cycle.
For a
so about 5
cycle,
days post ovulation is what you're looking for, because you're looking for progesterone that you did ovulate, and that's your body's producing progesterone, and then you're looking for that little estrogen bump. And the biggest difference for anyone who's wondering, like, why not just a blood test? Why not do a blood test on a certain time? You can, right? And that's most helpful if you're like, oh, I'm measuring myself at this certain time. And that's also something, side note, when we talk about any type of progress that you're measuring for yourself, measurements, weight, XY, right? Whatever health journey you're on, I always tell women to, if you're measuring yourself, compare your body to last month at that same time. So if you're on day 10 and you're like, I weigh myself every morning. Well, great, but don't compare yourself to last week. You were in a different body then, right?
Yep.
Compare yourself to last month at that same time frame, because that's going to be the most similar body that you're comparing to. Because so many things fluctuate. Yeah. But for blood testing and things like that, when you're testing things with blood, not that it's bad, it's just you're getting a mixture of free and bound hormone in that blood sample. Whereas a urine sample, you're just getting that free metabolite coming through. So you're getting what is bioavailable for your system that it can utilize. So that gives us a more of a clue of, okay, how is your system actually functioning? Do you have any available, androgen in your body that to do something with, versus, I got my hormones tested and it was a blood test and everything's fine. I'm using a lot of air quotes today.
It's all right. I like those air quotes, Beth. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. People are going to be like, what? This sounds weird. I'm moving my hands around like a crazy person. But that's, I got my blood tested, and, and a blood test can give you certain information. But it's free and bound hormone. Whereas a urine test, you get free hormone tested. That's why it's my favorite.
Yeah. And I think let's just cover this real quick for you, the listeners. Part of what we do in the medical profession, most of the diagnostic information we have and data is based on, all of it actually is based on blood labs, so it's blood for diagnoses. But the problem is that diagnosis doesn't always tell us what we want to know. Long before you are diagnosed with a particular condition, let's say, you are going to be having some dysfunction. And so one of the reasons that we also like using these functional tests, like the Dutch test, is for those of you who don't know this test, it's basically a test that uses saliva for cortisol and urine metabolites for estrogen, progesterone, and other hormones. But one of the reasons we use these tests is so that we can see the different metabolites and actually see how your body is utilizing these hormones, whereas a blood test just gives you a single point in time in blood and does not look at any of these other metabolites. So we wouldn't know, for example, how you're detoxifying estrogen, for example. We wouldn't necessarily know what the estrogen progesterone ratios might be. We wouldn't necessarily know if you are more of someone who is aromatizing your testosterone into estrogen. There's a lot of different things that we can tell you, not to mention how important cortisol is. So it sounds like this is essentially what you're doing, Beth. You're essentially saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that if we do blood, it's going to be fine for diagnostic purposes, in terms of, hey, you've got this particular condition, maybe, but it's not necessarily going to tell us some of the things about function that we can actually do something about. For example, if we see that you're metabolizing more to 16-hydroxy and 4-hydroxy estrogens, there are things that we can do for phase 1 liver detoxification or phase 2 liver detoxification that we wouldn't know to do if we were just getting a blood lab. And so it sounds like this is how you're doing things. And I would love for you to just walk us through so that they know when you are looking at, these hormones, what are you paying most attention to? Like, how much attention are you paying to cortisol? What are you liking to see? What are the things you're paying attention to with estrogen, progesterone, et cetera?
Yeah. Oh, this is a really good question. Very, I might go on a rant for a minute.
That's good. Dude, I like rants.
In looking at all of these things, a lot of times I take what their like worst symptom is and match it to what we're seeing on the labs first, just because you got to put out the biggest fire first. So often by the time women get a Dutch test or we're looking at something more comprehensive, things have been going on for such a long period of time. And like, oh, this is a subclinical, or, it's not, like the whole building hasn't burned down, but there's definitely fire started. Right. So we take the worst thing first and start working on that. And I am one that I want to sort of take a fire hose, there's a step-by-step process, but if your liver's not processing and, especially phase 1, phase 2 estrogen, I want to help support that. If your adrenals are not functioning well, want to help support that. And then overall, just the nutrients. And I feel like we talked about this just even last week, that so many women are undernourished, and that's a huge part of it, that even going into this, whatever we're doing to target specifically for each person that's customized, we have to also address the overall nutrient values that you're getting in. Otherwise, you don't have enough fuel to even have these processes happen. You're just, trying to drive a car on very little gas. You get like a half a cup of gas in the tank and you're like, I always say like drive to Duluth. I'm in Minnesota. Can't drive 3 hours in the car on just a half a cup of gas. You got to have that constant fuel and be really making sure you're nourishing your body really, really, really well first, to sort of do that repair work and get started with that. So
we'll be back after a quick break.
All right, time to talk about one of our sponsors. This one is one of my favorites. It's a long-time sponsor. You all know it. And if you don't, you are in for a treat. AG1. Now, for those of you who do not know AG1, I am very excited to introduce you to AG1 because it is one of the products that I've been taking for some time, and I take this almost every single day. It acts as my multivitamin. It acts as my probiotic. It acts as my green drink. It does a lot of different things. It's an antioxidant and it has adaptogen herbs in it. This is something I use straight up, a scoop in water. It's also something, surprisingly, that I put into my protein shakes. It does turn those protein shakes green, but the flavor is so neutral that I don't even notice it. And it is a great way to get all these nutrients in. The things I love about AG1 is all the things I just mentioned, but the fact that when you think about it, look at all the different products it replaces. Prior to AG1, I was taking a bunch of stuff, and it has replaced 3 to 5 different products for me. And so I really love this product. It is what most people would consider a greens drink if you just looked at it, but it is so much more than that. Now, I've taken greens drinks in the past. Number one, they tend to taste like swamp water. I love AG1 because it's a very neutral, pleasant flavor. And the other thing is that many of these used to raise my blood sugar because they put other things in it with extra starches, tapioca starch in particular, and AG1 does not do that. The other thing about AG1 is it does testing constantly on keeping its product clean, and it is on its 50 plus iterations, so they keep making this product better and better. But look, don't take my word for it. Really, you should try the product. To get AG1, all you have to do is go to drinkag1.com/next level. Drinkag1.com Next Level. And they have a couple deals for you specific to that link. This is one of my favorite products. I urge you to get on AG1. It's going to be one of those things that you do for a very long time and be extremely beneficial for your health. Check the product out. Drink ag1.com/next level, and let's get back to the show. Yeah, and it's interesting too, right? When we look at the hormonal situation, we can, you're talking about nutrients and energetics for women and men, but what we live in a culture where it seems like there's two metabolic states that most people occupy. You either got the couch potato who is sort of overfed, undernourished, right? So they're eating the Western American diet. There's lots of calories, but not a whole lot of nutrients. That's going to present problems for the hormonal system. Mm-hmm. And then you also have the sort of chronic dieter or chronic exerciser who is sort of the other extreme. They're moving around a lot. They're not eating a lot. So they're using up a lot of resources and they're not necessarily getting those nutrients in. And that actually has impact on this hormonal system. From my perspective, the metabolism is very much like a stress barometer. And certainly if it feels under stress, which nutrient sensing is part of its stress apparatus, like how much nutrient do I have to do what I need to do, then it's going to make a determination about reproduction. And we don't always think about it that way, but these hormones are their primary, sort of utility is in reproduction. That's what we evolved to sort of do. And so I love what you're saying about the nutrient aspect here and how paying close attention to the calorie gap, how much we're taking in versus how much we're burning. And perhaps more importantly, according to what you were saying, the nutrients, this is going to be a primary thing that's going to be impacting the hormone balance and hormone levels. And am I hearing you correct in that that's one of the things that we need to be, paying attention to?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I do see some of the, like you said, couch potato, but just more of the women that I come across, it's I'm doing everything. I'm running around, right? Like they're, very similar to me. Like I'm a mom, I've got 3 kids, very busy schedule, all the things, always on the go and always taking care of everybody else first. So it's easy to forget, or it's easy to let things like little things slide every day for yourself, right? I know that, I don't want to say better than anybody, but just the same as so many women who get stuck in this position of, I got up early and I went to the gym, but I was running late. So I just, threw back some coffee and did this really intense workout. And then I got home and then had to take so-and-so to the dentist and had to run here. Then I'm going to work and doing XYZ, got to get dinner on the table. And by the end of the day, you're so exhausted and wiped out. And then you realize, I barely ate today, and I had all these stressful things that I took care of and was taking care of everyone else, which is wonderful. But then day after day, week after week, year after year, you end up in a place where you're like, I don't understand. I'm working so hard. Why can't I get this type of a result that I used to get? You can't outwork it, Yeah,
yeah, because it's the stress effect, right? Yeah. And that's the part that I think we don't talk about enough. We talk about, hey, exercise more. Hey, watch your nutrition. But when it comes to stress management, we say it, but I don't necessarily think people really understand, and we don't actually often give the tools to how to manage stress, right? So we don't often kind of say, here are the kinds of things that will help you manage stress better. And one thing I'll just mention here, I'd be curious what your thought process is on it, especially when it comes to exercise, which I spent most of my career doing. Exercise is an interesting thing because most people, if you ask them what's their major way that they reduce stress, they will say exercise, which to me is problematic because exercise can be a positive stress. It can be an adaptation signal when it's done just enough in the Goldilocks zone. But if it's done too long, too intensely, too frequently, it oftentimes becomes an additional stress and you can't adapt to it. And we've seen this in trials like the alpha and beta trials. We've seen this with Dr. Herman Ponzer's work out of Duke University with constrained metabolism effects. We've seen compensatory reactions that slow metabolic rate, increase hunger and cravings. And we now know that in a sizable amount of people, and it seems that women are perhaps more sensitive to this than men, that it can, in about 25% of the women in research, cause compensatory eating reactions if it stresses you out. And so I oftentimes wonder, at least when I'm working with my female clients, there are about 10% of women who are hyper responders to exercise. They get really good results from it, but that's only 10%. 25% actually seem to gain weight with super intense, and this is coming from the alpha and beta trials, by the way. And then about 50% of women seem not to get any effect at all. So that's a full 75% of women who, doing traditional exercise, are not seeing the results from it that you would expect.
It's terrible.
Yeah, right. It's a really interesting
75%.
thing. Well, and it's really interesting because it brings up this whole idea of stress. And of course, if you ever listen to Herman Ponzer be interviewed on this stuff, he's saying, I'm not saying not to exercise. It can be healthy. What I'm saying is that exercise is not going to be the thing that a lot of people think it's going to be. But what I would add to that is I would say, yes, it is if it's done in the Goldilocks zone. If it's done correctly and not burning you out, more than it is sort of delivering this anti-stress effect. So it is one very important factor here, I think.
Yes, 100% agree. Yeah. And some of this is like I've been an athlete my whole life. I was a 3-sport athlete in high school. I got a scholarship to play volleyball in college, and then went right to grad school, still played competitive volleyball. I had my first 2 kids while I was in grad school. Do not recommend. And then at the same time, I was still playing volleyball. Like I remember nursing my second and being on the sidelines, and my teammates were like, Westy, get in here. We're starting warm-ups. And I'd be like, she's not done with the other side. Like, just like this is, there was that moment where I was like, this is too much.
Yeah, that's crazy, Beth. I love that story, though.
Right?
Yeah.
And I mean,
dedicated to your sport.
Right. But that's all I knew. Right.
Yeah.
I literally would think, okay, I only have an hour and a half to be at the gym. That's not enough time.
Yeah.
Because I was doing 2.5, 3-hour workouts. That's what we did in college. Where I went to school, they had the Olympic speed skating and wrestling center, and in northern Michigan. And so that was our training center. I was trained, weightlifting, deadlifting, heavy lifting. I was a beast.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But my lifting coach was the same lifting coach for the Olympic speed skaters who trained like Apollo Ono. Like we were in the same gym together, all this stuff. And I didn't know how to train like a normal person, is how I'll phrase that. And it really took me a while to learn. And even after having kids, I didn't know how to train like a normal person until I like worked with a regular trainer who was like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah. Like this can be a little bit much, and of course it brings up a point that the athletes, you probably were, athletes, at least the ones who care about performing over the long run, are not starving themselves with calories either. They are eating to fuel their sport, which is another, I think, lesson that we could all learn from. If you're going to be training like that, you certainly don't want to add to the stress by not eating.
Yes. Well, and at that point, with the stress of grad school, all the things, and nursing and things like that, I was constantly eating. I had to, otherwise I couldn't nurse, Yeah. So there was that, but there was definitely a breaking point in stress after I had my third, and how it showed up for me. So, and again, a lot of this comes from, I think, the stress response in the body. I graduated, started a business. It was not doing well. And then I had gotten pregnant again. And then I had my third. She was born 2 months early. So I had a preemie, a 2-year-old, and a 4-year-old, and a failing business. And I was stressed to the max, so exhausted, had been through, it was a traumatic birth experience, all that stuff. And after that, I started having ovarian cysts. I had PCOS.
Yeah.
Never had issues before, never had any cysts before in my life until that point. And I could not figure out why.
Yeah.
And my only recommendations, because the cyst would burst and I would have to go into I'd get like brought in, or I'd go in, make an appointment, doing all the things. the only thing they would tell me is, here's your birth control, here's your Vicodin. And I was like, okay, well, I can't be on Vicodin all the time. That's not a life choice that I can, like, I've got 3 babies at home and I'm running a business. I cannot do this, right? I'm seeing patients myself. I cannot be doped up all day. No, thank you. Like, and then the birth control, I was like, I get other side effects. Like, what other options are there for me? Like, I just wanted to know why this was happening. And no one could give me a solid answer. No one could tell me like, oh, well, let's look at other things in your life, or what are your stress levels? How hard are you working out still? All this stuff. And I was running myself into the ground and creating more health issues for myself. And it wasn't until I stopped. And so I'm licensed in acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And so a lot of the stuff that I talk about with eating for your hormones in your cycle comes from the Eastern medicine mindset of working with your body, working with your basal body temperature, all of that stuff. And that's what I started diving into and researching more, was the Eastern medicine side of stuff, because I wasn't getting any help or answers from Western medicine, which I know a lot of other people experience. So.
So walk us through that. I would love to hear how it works now. And I'll set this up. So we talked a little bit about the idea of when people come to see you, what you're normally doing is you're looking at, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're looking at major symptoms, right? And you're basically saying, okay, now let's run functional lab tests. It's not that you're opposed to blood labs, but you run functional lab tests like Dutch. You're looking at those things and you're trying to correlate that symptom stuff with the hormonal piece. And just for you listeners to know, one of the things that's really nice about Dutch for people like Dr. Westie and me is that it looks at cortisol rhythms. You can get a cortisol awakening response, which is a really nice way to see how people are responding to and recovering from stress, and also looks at all the different hormones, sex steroids, and their detoxification pathways. So it sounds like you're doing that. And then you are putting in this, which I find fascinating, this Eastern sort of approach. And I'm interested now in that, right? Because this is a very interesting way of doing this. My brother, by the way, is a master's in acupuncture and oriental medicine. So I have a little background, but not much. But I'm very curious now how you're merging this and what information it adds to, okay, I've got the symptoms. Okay, I've looked at your Dutch and your functional hormone panel. And now I'm doing this Eastern approach. What does that look like for women?
Yeah. So one of the things that I look at is, and just like splitting apart the cycle, people say, oh, you've got 4 different bodies throughout the month, all of that stuff, really looking at those different bodies and how can we correlate your overall nutrient. And when we talk about basal body temperature, it's lower in the first 2 weeks. So days 1 through 14 of the cycle. We want to match that with your foods to keep your basal body temperature lower. We don't want it spiking. We don't want it elevated. At that point, we want it nice and low and even and steady. So we talk about incorporating cooling foods. Cooling foods. It's which sounds weird, but you can Google it. And I have other lists and stuff online, but that cooling foods at that point, it's, chicken, turkey, fish. This is the tone of the food that you're consuming. More raw fruits and vegetables. Your body can your digestive system has different enzymes at that point that are more active. So you can break down the raw component of the fibers in those things. For women, if you're like, oh yeah, I eat a salad for lunch and it digests just fine. And then a week later I eat a salad and oh my gosh, I get bloated and I can't break it down as well. Yeah. Your digestive system is different, but so we're eating those cooling foods. There's different seasonings, rosemary, thyme, mint, cilantro, dill, just some of those that I'm throwing out here. Those are cooling for the system. So we want to incorporate more of those at that time to work with that lower basal body temperature. After ovulation, temperature spikes, stays elevated. We want to flip the switch and go to warming. Warming foods, right? Red meat is very warming. Beef, bacon, venison, bison, all that stuff. Cooking your fruits and veggies more so your digestive system can break down that fibrous component easier. Spicy foods, hot sauce, put it on everything. Ginger, cinnamon, turmeric, nutmeg, just different seasonings that you can layer in your foods then to kind of work with that higher basal body temperature. And that it's an easy thing to do using foods that you like, right? It's not restrictive. It's not exclusive or anything, but it's an easy way just to start the process of leaning towards cooling, warming, working with that body temperature to help regulate the pattern and help support how your body is going to process nutrients and process everything else internally. It's a very, I'll say, gentle way of doing things, like just to get started. Yeah.
Yeah. This is very interesting. And I'm assuming, like most things that are, ancient wisdom, philosophies and medicine, you won't find a lot of research that I'm aware of on something like this, but you see this clinically being effective for women throughout the menstrual cycle. What is it that you mainly see this helps with? Is it helping with, premenstrual stuff? Is it helping with mood? Is it helping with energy? What is going on with women when they adapt this sort of cooling in the first half of the menstrual cycle, warming in the second half of the menstrual cycle type of approach?
Yeah. So I started incorporating this because, so one of my postgraduate certifications that I got, and this is again in Eastern medicine and Chinese medicine, my professor was one of the top fertility specialists in the US. And he has since passed away, but this was part of some of the methods that he used. And so I was like, this is great. And if you do, again, clinical research that's done now, right? They don't do research on this necessarily, again, in the Western world, but this is present all over Eastern medicine, Ayurveda, all of that. This is a thing where a lot of women have been doing this for thousands of years, like seed cycling. They just don't do a lot of studies on it now. But to more specifically answer your question, what do I see with this? How does it help? I see the best results in incorporating this with the other recommendations, from a Dutch test, seeing some of that, and then incorporating these things to help regulate your system because you're changing what you're doing on a daily, weekly basis to help support your hormonal shift and change throughout the month. I've had gals that, I had a gal, She had twin boys. They were 18 months old. And since she gave birth, she was like, my cycle is 19, 20 days long. I have my period every 19 or 20 days and I'm going bananas. I cannot handle this. And so we just started incorporating gently because she's like, I'm still nursing. I'm having all these other things. I can't do X, Y, and Z for supplementation. Totally fine. Let's just start utilizing warming, cooling and try to lengthen or match a pattern to your hormones with that. And it was, it doesn't happen right away. It takes a little time, but she was, after the second month, she was like, I've had a 28 day cycle, fairly regular. And she was not a complicated case overall necessarily, but,
and this is just from changing up the warming, cooling foods, or is this the whole approach?
This was part of the whole approach. Cause some of her other recommendations, if someone's still nursing, you're limited on some of the recommendations that you can give them. So we were very few, supplementation recommendations, but otherwise it was mainly really hammering on the warming and cooling and helping support her system that way.
Interesting.
Yeah. And incorporating seed cycling and doing all of that stuff too. And
we'll be back after a quick break.
All right. Time to break into the show for one of our sponsors. This is a brand new sponsor, and there is a lot of neat research around this product that you're going to want to listen to and pay attention to. The product is Qualia Senolytic. This product helps to address one of the key discoveries of the last decade in regard to aging. As our cells age, many of them begin to become arrested in their development. These cells stop dividing. They become senescent cells, kind of like zombie cells, right? These cells that are just hanging around, no longer dividing, and secreting negative compounds that have negative effects on the body. This is a product, Qualia Senolytics, that addresses this effect. Now, you might think, what about exercise and diet and fasting and cold plunges and all these things? Aren't these things going to help with this? Well, here's the interesting thing. We all age, right? No matter what you do, we all know that we're going to age and you're going to see the signs of aging. Research is suggesting this is because of these senescent cells and all these things I just mentioned, fasting, proper diet, exercise, all these things seem not to make much of a difference when it comes to these senescent cells. So how do we get rid of these zombie cells and help that middle age feeling that a lot of us get after we turn 40? I know I did. That's what this product, Qualia Senolytics, does. It's like pruning the yellowing leaves off of a dead plant. It removes worn out senescent cells to allow for the rest of the body to begin to thrive. And all you need to do is use this compound 2 days a month, 6 capsules one day, 6 capsules the next day, and you will get the effects of these senolytic agents to remove these zombie cells from the body. The formula is non-GMO, it's vegan, gluten-free, and the ingredients are meant to complement one another, factoring into the combined effect of all these ingredients together. Not only that, this product comes with a 100-day money-back guarantee. If you don't begin to feel higher energy levels, feeling younger, more productive, and more enthusiastic, and especially what happened to me, less aches and pains. How do you get this product? So you can take advantage of getting rid of these senescent cells. All you have to do is go to neurohacker.com/human. And when you do, you'll get up to $100 off. When you use the code HUMAN at checkout, you'll get an additional 15% off. That's neurohacker.com/human and use the code HUMAN on checkout. Look, aging is one of those things that is incredibly difficult to do, even when we're doing all the right things with diet and exercise and fasting and all the tools we know. This is one of those products that is insurance on helping us age better. Check out Qualia Senolytics, neurohacker.com/human, and let's get back to the show. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about seed cycling because I'm not sure everyone knows exactly what that is.
Yeah. So seed cycling is just altering your seeds throughout the month. Very similar to the warming and the cooling. So cooling days 1 through 14. And again, there's some different styles of this, but the most popular one I will say is the one I recommend because that's where clinically I get the most results from it. Days 1 through 14, it's pumpkin and flax seed, just 1 tablespoon of each every day, raw, ground. I recommend grinding them. Otherwise,
raw pumpkin and flaxseed ground, 1 tablespoon daily during the first 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle.
Yep. And then
day 1 being bleeding for those who.
Yes. Yeah. And then days 15 through 28, you just switch to the seeds. Same process, 1 tablespoon raw, ground, sesame and sunflower. And if you're allergic to sesame or something like that, just leave that one out. That's fine. But just 1 tablespoon of each ground, and you can incorporate it into a smoothie, a shake, salad, whatever. I make protein balls with them that way. Another great way to help with everything. And when you look at the micronutrients in those seeds, what's really cool is that pumpkin and flax, they help with certain, pathways in phase 1, phase 2, estrogen detoxification. And then you get to the sesame sunflower and it helps with completely different things in that hormone processing. So throughout the month, you're hitting all these pathways, like a good scope of it, but it's just altering kind of what your focus is on at different times of the month. So.
Interesting. So pumpkin and flax, first part of the menstrual cycle, sesame and sunflower in the second part. Yeah. And that is interesting, right? That you're applying some of these nutrients we talked about that are, having an effect. What about exercise during these times? What kind of exercise do you recommend? And do you change up your exercise recommendations for women during the menstrual cycle?
Yeah. This was something that I'll just be honest was really hard for me personally.
As the recovering athlete.
Yes. As the recovering, if I'm not working out for 2 hours straight, if I'm not changing my shirt because it's so sweaty, it's not worth it, Yeah. Ridiculous. Anyway, after days 5-ish or so, when estrogen starts to rise, estrogen helps, build lean muscle faster and recovery and all that stuff. So incorporating more strength training, incorporating more, you can do higher intensity and have a faster recovery, right? So doing more of that overall. And then the second part, essentially, and here's the thing where people will talk about do more endurance or do more yoga or which for sure you can. The hard thing for me again is that I'm like, oh, if I'm training for something, how am I going to do that? How am I going to change that up? If for women who love to go to a class, oh, I love to do a kickboxing class. Oh, I go to Orange Theory or I go to, whatever boot camp. Great. Then it's more altering, not necessarily what you're doing, but maybe, you can push your weights more weeks 1 and 2 and you lighten up on the weights a little bit, but work on a little bit more of the endurance piece of it, but also give yourself a little bit more recovery time. So for example, for myself right now, I make sure that I do a creatine weeks 3 and 4 before I do any type of strength training workout. And then I'm getting branched chain amino acids in to help support that recovery. And I will give myself a little bit more of a break in between sets. And it makes a difference in my performance, and I will be honest, like mentally, I struggle a little bit with the whole, you've already taken a 30-second break, get back on it, And I'm like, nope, you can take a 45-second break, just give yourself a little beat, and then get back into it. And I can feel the difference in my muscle strength and how well I can finish out a workout in weeks 3 and 4 versus 1 or 2. To make it, I want to say, I don't want to make it just as effective, but it feels like I mean, especially week 2, you step into a workout, I feel like I can kick butt and it's easy to push through whatever. And then you step into week 3 and I'm like, what happened? I'm so out of shape.
And the way I look at this, and you can kind of, give any of your thoughts on this. The way I've always looked at this is that just so those of you listening understand this, the research on this is anything but clear. And usually when you see that in the research, it's because each woman is so different. But in general, what Dr. Westie is essentially saying is that you essentially have estrogen at its highest the week before and after ovulation. And essentially estrogen is very much like male testosterone. It allows women to recover faster, push harder. They're more motivated. It does a lot of different things, helps you train harder, and you can handle more stress. And so the way I look at that is that when we're looking at exercise, you can break it down into duration, long workouts, very intense workouts, or very frequent workouts. They do best when estrogen is around when estrogen is dominant, because you can train harder and recover faster. Yeah. And as soon as estrogen begins to fall away and progesterone is more dominant and or estrogen is low, which would be premenstrually and menstrually, what happens is decrease the intensity, decrease the frequency, decrease the duration of your workouts. And if you're doing the same thing, that would just mean rather than doing, let's say Barry's boot camp 5 days per week, you're doing it 3 days per week. Yeah. And you're doing a little bit more walking, or maybe you're adding in some yin yoga and stuff like that. That's kind of how I look at that. But of course, I always get asked this question, Beth, and I wonder how you do too. And women go, do I have to do this? And the truth is, no, I don't think that you have to. I'd be curious what you think. But I do think that many women find this to be very powerful in just even with their mood. Premenstrually and menstrually can be a time where a lot of women do not want and feel like they can train as hard. And this can be a nice way to sort of balance things out, kind of living that more athletic female lifestyle, in that high estrogen time, and living more of like the Parisian lifestyle, eating, less and just walking and not doing a lot of crazy intense stuff in the low estrogen times. And I think this is very beneficial, which then brings us to the thing I want to cover with you before we break, because I know you have a book on this too, is what happens at menopause and how to manage that transition. Because perimenopause, from my perspective, looks a lot like a continuous premenstrual syndrome. You got progesterone falling and estrogen being pretty volatile, and there's a lot of even PMS type symptoms during this time, right? And then, of course, menopause, estrogen and progesterone both are low. And those are two different hormonal states. Now, just so people are clear on this, diagnostically speaking, menopause is a diagnosis, which is essentially you haven't had menses for a year. and you have an FSH to correspond with this of 30 or greater typically. But when I'm talking about menopause, I'm not using it as a diagnostic term. I'm more using it as a hormonal state. So post-menopausal, you're going to have low estrogen, low progesterone. Perimenopausal, you're going to have low progesterone, and at times high estrogen, and at other times low estrogen. And this transition also, lends itself well to doing things a bit differently. So I'm curious how you manage this transition and what you do differently with women.
Yeah. So I think the hardest thing for a lot of women when they enter that perimenopause space is that, you just don't have that sufficient counterbalance, throughout that short period of time of a month. Estrogen, then progesterone, right? Like those counterbalance each other really beautifully if you're processing them well. Then you get into perimenopause and they don't counterbalance. So if you're not processing really, really well when you enter that space, what I typically see is that it's a tough time. It is a rough ride through that until getting into full-blown menopause. And a lot of this, again, that I'm going to talk about is from an Eastern medicine perspective, that it is a natural phase for women to go in. In my book, The Female Fat Solution, I have a whole section that talks about the different bodies that women go through in their life. And I call it the 7 bodies of Eve, just for, to represent like you had said originally at the beginning, that men kind of have 2 bodies in their life. Right. And for women, like we go through all these different bodies. And menopause is one of them, and how to really work with that shift and change, and to understand first and foremost that your body's functioning differently. You're living in a different meat suit. So all the things that you did before that worked and that were really great, they're not going to work now because you're living in a different body. And that if your body can function well and process internally really, really well, then you're going to have a better outcome, or be able to take advantage of, the different hormones that are, dominant, now. And without that elevated estrogen and progesterone flux going on, you're really looking at androgens. It's not the same amount of androgen that men have, right? But it's something. You want to have something. You don't want to be totally depleted and burnt out by the time you get to menopause, that your body has a hard time creating enough cortisol and androgen to even get you through your day. So, I don't even know if I answered your question now originally.
Yeah. I mean, I think the take home here is that there are big changes that women need to be aware of, and that this natural cycle that women will have in their younger days begins to change. The way I'll offer some of my feedback on this too. The way I look at it is I tend to think of this as, just to give a metaphor, think of Joan of Arc. And Joan of Arc has her suit of armor, which is more protective than the shield. I call that estrogen, right? It's because estrogen is protective against cortisol and makes the body more insulin sensitive. Now, the shield, progesterone, is also protective against stress, but not as much as estrogen would be. And of course, you have the sword, which represents testosterone. So at perimenopause, women lose the shield, which means they are more now stress sensitive and stress reactive, which means from my perspective, you begin to needing to ease up a little bit on this extreme dieting, like eating too much and not exercising becomes more of a stress, and exercising too much and not eating enough becomes more of a stress. But to me, this is a stress management time for women. Now, as soon as progesterone and estrogen fall away, now she loses her suit of armor too, right? So she has no shield, she has no suit of armor. She's even more stress reactive, and now she's more insulin resistant, which from my perspective means you better take as much care as you can doing lots of the stress management type of stuff. And also maybe instead of just looking at calories, maybe you want to look at controlling carbohydrates as the means by which you're controlling your calorie intake. And then, of course, this doesn't happen with all women from my perspective on my reading of things and my clinical experience. But for a sizable amount of women, there does become, and there's an argument to be made this happens in all women, they become a little bit more testosterone dominant, even though testosterone falls as well. Now imagine Joan of Arc, no suit of armor, no shield, still has the sword, but it's, a quarter of the length. It's broken, but it's still there. So the testosterone androgen is a little bit more dominant in women. And from that perspective, to me, at that point, weight training can really benefit. So to me, with perimenopause, it's stress management. At menopause, it's stress management with carb reduction.
Yeah.
And at postmenopause, it's adding in weight training. And that 1, 2, 3 seems to have done really well for me in my clinical experience. But I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that or have anything to add.
No, 100%. Yes, 100%. That's exactly what it is. And one of the things too, and I know, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Stacey Sims.
Yep.
Some of her work. Yeah. Because she talks about the same thing as well. And again, that's the exact same thing I've seen clinically over and over again, especially entering menopause, with the just physical ability to process carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
The enzymes in your stomach change. It's not that, oh, I'm doing something wrong, that I can't eat these carbs, or shoot, what's wrong with me with all of this stuff? Well, if you're too stressed out and not taking care of your cortisol levels, you're going to crave those carbs. And then you don't have the enzymes to break them down or process them very well. And it's just adding gas to the fire from that point.
We'll be back after a quick break.
All right. Well, I have a new partnership to announce that I am very excited about. And this partnership is with the next level human company, ButcherBox. I consider them a next level human company because they are doing everything they can to source the best quality meats, as well as source those meats from companies and farmers that are committed to sustainable and regenerative animal husbandry, raising animals in the way that they are naturally supposed to be raised and doing right by the environment. And it is just what it sounds like, a butcher box. Imagine you had a butcher right down the street from you that put a box together for you of all the best quality meats that you could find. And that is what ButcherBox does. They send them frozen right to your door. And the animals are the highest quality, 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef, never given antibiotics or hormones, humanely raised. Grass-fed beef is an incredible source of omega-3 acids, vitamins, and minerals. It is one of the healthiest foods on the planet. Not only is the beef superior, but they also raise crate-free pork that are humanely raised. Also, never with antibiotics or hormones in any of their meats. They also really pay special attention to their chicken. These are pasture-raised chicken, heirloom breeds. This means ancient breeds, wild breeds. They never give them antibiotics or hormones, and these are free-ranging animals that can run out in the pasture and eat all of the worms and bugs and everything else to make their meat incredibly healthy. And they also do free-range turkey and wild-caught seafood. And this seafood is wild-caught, sustainably harvested, no artificial coloring, no additives, just straight from the sea. Your health is going to get better, and it is much better for the environment. If you want to get involved, there's 2 ways to do this. One, you can go to drj.com/butcherbox, and you can choose between 3 curated boxes, or you can do what I do, which is make your own box. That's drj.com/butcherbox. And when you sign up using that link, you can choose between a free year of salmon, a free year of ground beef, or a free year of chicken breast. I love ButcherBox. I use them myself. I am so excited that they are now sponsoring the podcast. drjade.com/butcherbox. And let's get back to the show. Yeah, and by the way, for you listeners, what Dr. Westy just said has actually been shown in research. It's actually been shown that even thin, this is a really interesting study by Epple et al. A couple years back that basically looked at thin women with apple body shapes. And the way to describe this is thinner women with waist to hip ratios that are higher than normal. So these are women who are thin in their extremities, but heavy in the middle. And what they showed is that these women release more cortisol to stress challenges, and that they tend to store more fat around the middle. And they also tend to be overcompensators with food. And this may happen. This may be, we don't know exactly, how this is. Of course, it's not the case for all women. It's never the case for everyone. But if you're someone who knows that stress causes you to overeat, right? You may be one of these stress reactive women. And as you get into perimenopause and menopause, this becomes more of the norm, that women become more stress reactive, which is why you see this shift in belly fat. And I oftentimes get this question with hormone replacement therapy. Does hormone replacement therapy reverse this? The research actually shows hormone replacement therapy does reverse, have some mitigating effect on fat storage around the middle, but it doesn't actually result in weight loss. In fact, it may actually promote a little bit of weight gain, but it does keep the hourglass shape. And the only reason I bring that up is that HRT, even bioidentical, seems to have this effect. And so there's no getting away from the lifestyle things you need to do, even if you're doing HRT. And I don't know what you would think about that, Beth, if you agree.
I love how you said there's no getting away from it, right? There's just no, you're absolutely right. There is no getting away from it. I think a lot of times, just try like, oh, I should take this and then it's going to solve all my problems, XYZ. Oh man, you live in a different body when your hormones change. And again, for the female body specifically, it is a very different journey throughout our lives. I mean, like a 30-year span of time, 20-year span of time, you can live in so many different bodies.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it can go from working on your fertility to having a kid to postpartum to try and get your body back and Then you enter perimenopause and menopause. And for some women that they're having kids later in life in their late 30s, early 40s, then they're just jumping right from postpartum into perimenopause. That is rough. And so I love how you've said this several times. And the last time you just said it, you said like, of course, this isn't for everybody. Like this is not everybody's case. That's the other thing I feel like women get really derailed on is that you'll hear a story or you'll have a friend or your sister or somebody that has this hormonal story. And so you'll try to do the same things that they did and it won't work for you.
100%.
Right.
Yeah.
And you said this just so beautifully, like it is different for everybody. Like when we're talking about some of these cases or what can happen typically or see this or that, you might be having something totally different go on.
Yeah.
Which is so frustrating.
It really is. But I do think it goes back to what I say is the number one rule in all of health and fitness. There's only one rule, in my opinion, that is do what works for you.
Yeah.
Don't try to look at what other people are doing. Stop, really learn to study yourself, which is where it can be really useful to, talk to people like me, talk to people like you who have a vast amount of clinical experience with different women and come at this from clinically different ways because, the Jade Teta approach is going to work a little bit different for people and different people will vibe with it versus the Beth Westie approach versus other approaches. So I always like to tell people it's about being a metabolic detective, right? It's like, absorb what is useful, discard what is not, make sure you keep what is uniquely your own and really become a student of how your body is functioning. Now, I know you have lots of resources on your site. So before we wrap up, I would love for you to tell them, because I find this whole idea of, these different foods, the Eastern approach that you take, I think is very interesting. I can imagine that many, many people would benefit from this approach. And it's probably not something that they have tried in their metabolic detective work yet. And you're giving, a free resources for them. So how can they learn more about this and get into your world?
Yeah. So I have just on my website, which is drbethwesty.com, a free recipes for your cycle cookbook. And if you're like, oh, what if I'm in perimenopause or menopause? Like it explains in there too, how you can get started with some of that. But they're just like healthy, high protein, simple recipes, things that you can make for your whole family too. Cause again, that's a question I get a lot of the time where if I'm eating for my cycle, what about my husband? What about my kids or whatever?
Yeah, they'll do fine on that, right?
Yeah. Yes. Right. I'm married and I've got 3 kids. I have a boy and 2 girls. And so it's easy to incorporate these things for your whole family. And again, some of it is just as simple as adding more spice to what you're eating specifically or not putting spice on it. I use the example of tacos, right? Because I've got kids and everybody wants their taco. I didn't want the cheese on top. I wanted it on the bottom this time. You can build it yourself however you want, kiddo. Okay. Yeah. So it's an easy thing to do. Like in the cooling phase, chicken tacos, and I'll use a lot more cilantro. and add no spice. Right. Yeah. And then in the warming phase, we'll use venison. My husband hunts a lot. So he's, have deer in the freezer. And so we'll use that, and I'll add a ton of peppers, spice to that to help bring that warming component into it. Again, an easy thing that you can do, just being aware of where your hormones are at.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. And also, Dr. Westie has 2 books for you all too. So the female fat solution and the menopause solution as well, female menopause solution on her site. And you can follow her at Dr. Beth Westie on Instagram, which I do. And, we just kind of did a podcast flip. I've really enjoyed getting to know your, sort of your approach and learning from you. And so I appreciate that. Is there anything else that you want to make sure, any final words you have for anyone who's interested in this space?
Yeah. I want to say thank you to I really enjoyed having you on my podcast. It was fun. And the one thing I really love is that I feel like we have the same message. So the way you talk about it is a little bit different, or the acronyms that you have for what you're describing is different than kind of maybe what I say. But I feel like it's the same message. And I think it's so important that the more people can understand that message overall and connect with it and work with it, it becomes more of a mainstream versus an outlier of what people are doing. But I think that, it's
100%.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'll say that is, I think most of my listeners know this, but from my perspective, it's weird being a man who does, in this space. And I'm so appreciative of, you allowing me to, be in this discussion with you for sure. And I've really very happy that you and I have connected, and just want to say thank you so much for your work. And I do think what's really cool about what you say, right, is that because everyone's different, they're all going to vibe in different ways. And so from my perspective, I really want to highlight different practitioners who are doing things in slightly different ways, because I know that my approach and just the fact that I'm a man and we all are just different. So some people want to hear that. Some people don't. Some people are more into the Eastern philosophy. We all have our things. And that's what's beautiful about this. And I would say for the listeners that you want to pay attention to that, pay attention to the people you vibe with. And, with your metabolic detective work, I just happen to think that Dr. Westie is one of those people you could benefit immensely from learning from her approach. And some of you are going to find tremendous results there. And so, I really appreciate your work, and thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. This is great.
Yeah, it's been great. Just hang on the line real quick, because I want to make sure this all uploads. But for all of you, thanks for hanging out, and we will see you on the next show. You have been listening to the Next Level Human podcast with Dr. Jade Teta. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe and consider leaving a review. You make the biggest difference when you pass on your lessons and inspire others. That's why reviews like this are so powerful. Your words may be the only ones that resonate for someone else. Please remember the information in this podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your personal physician or therapist before making any lifestyle changes. And finally, thank you for who you are in the world and the difference you make.